With the addition of DJ Jones on the Denver Broncos defensive line, can the Broncos have a top 5 run defense in 2022? We take a look at the Broncos defensive interior and the defensive end position on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome back into Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every single day. Thank you once again for making us your first listen of the day and our favorite podcast and provider, or whether you're watching on YouTube, you can follow myself on Twitter, Cody Roark, at Cody Roark NFL. You can follow Sayre Bedinger at Sayre Bedinger. And on today's episode of the show, we're going to focus on the Broncos defensive line, an area that in the offseason, the team looked at adding some beef up front, pun intended, when it comes to just size and maybe even athleticism at this position. So excited to break it all down with you here today, my friend. There's a lot of players involved in this room, and there's going to be a lot of tough choices that the personnel department will have to make when final roster cuts approach.
Definitely. And that's kind of a common theme on these previews that we've been doing, right? Is a lot of tough decisions are soon to be made by the Denver Broncos front office and the coaching staff. And you got to love it on the defensive line. I mean, this was such a key. We've talked before about maybe, comparing this team roughly to the Super Bowl 50 team, and can they be better? Like, could this team be better than the Super Bowl 50 team? Could it be better than the 2012 team? I remember on that Super Bowl 50 team, Cody, one of the great things was having just a great rotation of defensive linemen, right? You had the Derek Wolfe and you had Sylvester Williams. You obviously had Malik Jackson, those guys terrorizing people. But behind them, then you had other guys like Vance Walker, who was such a key piece throughout the season, and other players on that D line that were so good. And I think for the Denver Broncos, that's what you're looking for, is you're looking to, just like with guys off the edge, you want to come in waves. You want to be able to rotate guys in and out, guys that can play multiple positions. Thankfully, I think the Broncos have a variety here of both veterans and young players that could come in and really make a huge impact in 2022.
Well, let's start off with one of the key offseason free agent acquisitions. During NFL free agency, the Broncos needed a boost against the run, and so they go out and they get San Francisco 49ers defensive lineman DJ Jones in free agency. And Sayre, I feel like he's the one player that, in my opinion, that was brought over in the offseason that has, I think, the ability to, he, alongside some other players fully healthy, can make the Broncos run defense a top 5 unit in the NFL. We knew last year just how rough it was, especially after injuries decimated it, where they seemingly couldn't stop anybody. Now I feel like they've addressed some of those holes, at least on paper. We'll have to see on the on-field product. But, where can DJ Jones help the Broncos defense this season, in your opinion?
I think, Cody, I see him making a lot of plays behind the line of scrimmage, right? We've said before, 17 tackles for loss over the last couple seasons for DJ Jones. Just an absolute force on the interior, and certainly doesn't get enough credit. I think definitely more of a guy that NFL executives and front office personnel were a fan of than maybe the general NFL fan, the general NFL analyst. I mean, this guy obviously get a 3-year, $30 million deal for good reason. And after the Broncos, traded Shelby Harris to the Seattle Seahawks in that deal to get Russell Wilson, they had to find some way to replace that production on the D line. And I think with DJ Jones, even though he's a second contract and big money player, I think there's untapped pass rush potential. So we've seen it with the 49ers, you turn on his tape, man, that guy lives in the backfield. But could there be untapped potential yet, even as a pass rusher? I know that hasn't necessarily been his game, but it also isn't necessarily a weakness of his either. I mean, there's a lot of mouths to feed, so to speak, in San Francisco with guys coming off the edge, other players through the last handful of years that have been racking up the sacks on the defensive line, like Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner when he was there. So certainly a lot of different factors that play for why DJ Jones' sack numbers might be down, but living in that backfield for the opposing offense, I think that's where he's going to make his biggest impact in 2022.
Well, and I'll tell you this too. You look at that San Francisco front seven, very, very good last season. The Broncos, I think they have a very solid defensive line, but I feel like a lot of the questions, I think Josie Jewell will be great at inside linebacker, at the middle backer against the run. Will the other linebacker, whoever it may be, whether it be Jonas Griffith, whether it be Alex Singleton, will they be able to maintain that? And I think that, hey, if Jonas Griffith becomes the guy we all think he can, Broncos front seven is going to be really dang good next season, and that will allow a guy like DJ Jones to thrive more. But even another guy who plays the same position, Mike Purcell, there's always a question. I think a lot of Broncos fans are wondering, how can you utilize both Mike Purcell and DJ Jones? And DJ's already said it. Like, he's like, if I have to play a 5 tech, I'll play a 5. If I have to play a 4, I can play a 4. If I have to play a 0, a 1, or a 2, he says, I can play those techniques here. And I think that the Broncos are looking, I think, in run stopping situations, and specifically when they play like Josh Jacobs, maybe when they play a team like the Tennessee Titans, teams that love to just pound the rock. I definitely feel like we'll see both Draymond Jones, Mike Purcell, DJ Jones on the field at the same exact time. Will all three of them be base starters on this defense? I'm not quite sure if that's going to be the thing. I think they're going to figure out the rotation because there's a lot of other players at defensive end, guys that can play there. They're going to be very good as well. So I don't think that the Broncos are going to limit themselves to just those big guys on the defensive interior. Then with their pass rushers, I wouldn't be opposed to it. But, in your opinion, looking at Mike Purcell, fully healthy coming into this training camp, which is great. He wasn't facing that last year coming into camp. He's still dealing with that injury that he had. He just had the hardware removed from his foot where he had surgery. In your opinion, what do you think about Mike Purcell and DJ Jones, and maybe how they can both play off of each other a little bit?
I think a fully healthy Mike Purcell is a huge addition to the Denver Broncos defense, if I can call it that, right? Because even last year when we saw him out on the field, he was wearing the club on his hand and really wasn't able to be as effective as we saw back in 2019 when he signed out of the what league was that? The AAF or whatever it was back at the time. He signed to the Denver Broncos as just kind of like a, hey, let's throw this at the wall and see if it sticks. And all of a sudden, he was one of the team's most productive run defenders. I think he had 8 tackles for loss that season, and just really a breakout year that led to the contract that he's obviously finishing up here in 2022. But if he's fully healthy, I mean, he is strong on that defensive interior, and DJ Jones as well. Those guys both excel at being able to get that initial punch and just drive linemen backward. And really, like I said, with DJ Jones, live in that offensive backfield. So that's where I see Mike Purcell, maybe a little version of kind of like the Bash brothers out there for those two guys. If you're a Mighty Ducks fan from the 90s, I mean, I could see a little bit of that. You see Mike Purcell out there living in the backfield. Then the next play, it's DJ Jones. I think ultimately where these two guys can really help the Broncos together, where they can feed off each other, play off each other, however you want to put it. I think if these two guys can help the Denver Broncos shut down the run on early downs, it's going to make everything in this defense better, because that's what we saw on that Super Bowl 50 team, right? Was we saw that team just absolutely clamps against the run. One of the best run defenses that I can recall seeing. But it wasn't just that. It was that once they shut down the run, then they were able to bring that heat off the edge and utilize the no-fly zone to its fullest potential. That's what I think we need to see. It starts with Mike Purcell and DJ Jones on that interior, making sure that teams can't do what the Cleveland Browns did to the Denver Broncos last year, or what the Raiders did to the Denver Broncos at the end of last season. You cannot have those kind of games, and these two guys are going to be key to making sure that the Broncos stay in that top 10, top 5 maybe run defense throughout the season.
Interior crocodile alligator, my friend. I'm excited to see this happen. We're going to be at training camp next week. We're going to be following along the defensive line, what the rotation may look like a little bit, who rises, who falls a little bit. You get all that here on the Lockdown Broncos podcast. But coming up here in just a moment, as it pertains to the defensive line, Draymond Jones is a player that we believe will be the most disruptive player on the Broncos defensive line this upcoming season. What might that mean for him? What might that mean for the defense and the success of the team overall? We break that down coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Built Bar, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And make sure you go to Built.com here today to check out the 9 amazing original flavors, plus the occasional limited time flavors like the coconut brownie chunk puff, available at Built.com here today. Each bar is healthy for you. They contain 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. That is tremendous value for something that is covered in 100% milk chocolate. And I want you and your family to experience the joys that Built Bar brings to our faces when we consume one by going to Built.com. And when you get to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCK15. You know what that's going to do? That's going to get you 15% off your next order today at Built.com. Can Draymond Jones be the most disruptive defensive lineman on the Broncos and maybe potentially in the NFL this season? It's going to be hard with a guy like Aaron Donald playing in Los Angeles, but how can Draymond Jones maybe break out onto the scene this upcoming season. Once again, thank you so much, everybody, for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe and you're following along so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more, all in one place. 30 minutes or less, daily and bite-sized. We have you covered. Sayre, we have raved, I feel like, all offseason about Draymond Jones. We've heard some of his press conference clips. He's always got some good ones, one of them being he was asked about Russell Wilson and how hard is Russell Wilson's mobility at making it harder for you to get after him. He says, really doesn't do anything for me. I'm a football player. And I love that. He's the type of guy on Friday Night Lights, the character, the defensive line guy that literally doesn't say a word, doesn't say much, but goes out and dominates, wrecks havoc. And then you get to deal with all the fun quotes that you get in some press conference scrums as well. In your opinion, what is it about Draymond Jones that has stood out to you over the course of his career, and maybe why he might break out and have a dominant season here in 2022 as the headliner of the defensive end room?
Well, he's just becoming a complete overall player, isn't he? We can see that happening. We've seen him absolutely take over entire drives for a team. I mean, he has been dominant at times for the Denver Broncos. And I don't think that in saying that, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that he hasn't been consistent either, because that's not the case. I think that he's been consistently getting better. I mean, he's had better games than others. He's put up better stats in certain games than others. But I think what's been great to see from Draymond Jones is the fact that, man, this guy plays at, I don't even know if he plays at 280 pounds, to be honest with you. I mean, he just looks light. He just looks rocked up every time we see him, doesn't he? He looks more like a traditional defensive end than an interior defensive lineman, but he's able to play with such good strength, such good leverage and quickness off the ball. I mean, over the last 2 seasons, we've seen 22 QB hits, 37 total pressures over the course of his career. We've seen 15 and a half sacks. We saw the interception. We've seen all these different things. I think there's just so much that he's got going on a play-to-play basis that he's going to draw a lot of attention this coming season. And if he's not drawing the attention, if it's Randy Gregory or Bradley Chubb or DJ Jones or somebody else, I think that's where Draymond Jones is really going to absolutely feast. And we know going into contract year, there's no better time.
Just a couple days ago, I got a chance to sit down with Broncos fan favorite Derek Wolfe, when he's discussing like what's going on, reflecting on some Super Bowl 50 stuff. He played a true 4-eye technique, which was on the inside shade of the offensive tackle. So he and Von Miller on the defensive left side really shut things down because he was that anchor point. And I think for a guy like Draymond, if you get him in that 4-eye and you even bump him to a 3 sometimes, depending on what you decide to do, if you're going to blitz a nickel guy there, I would put Draymond at a 3. I'd put your outside linebacker, bump him in maybe to a 5 technique, and then you can send guys off the edge there. But I think for a guy like Draymond Jones, if he plays that 4-eye, man, he is so strong. Like from the point of attack, he has a grip that just locks into the inner part of the shoulder pads, the chest pad of an offensive lineman. He knows how to violently throw guys away. I mean, do we even have to bring it up? Kansas City Chiefs fans won't want to hear this, but he absolutely ate the lunch of Joe Thuney in that regular season finale at the end of last year for this Broncos team. I mean, that is the type of product that he puts on the field consistently. And granted, the first couple of years of his career, I mean, this is a guy that's been battling some injuries. Last year was his first year as a full-time starter, and I think that we will see even more from him this upcoming season because of that. And I think you can scheme him in certain ways, right? We see the Rams and how they use a guy like Aaron Donald. I think if Ejiro Evero takes a little bit of a page out of the experience of working with some of the defenses that he's had the chance to be a part of with a guy like Aaron Donald, you know that they put Aaron Donald everywhere. He's not just limited to just one position. So I'm not saying that you're going to put a guy like Draymond on the edge. I would say you want to put him in a 4-eye. You want to put him in a 0. You want to put him in a 1 technique, which is in the A gap or on one of the outside shades of the center. To me, I think the Broncos have not unleashed Draymond yet to, I think, his full potential. And the fact that we're saying that and we see just how good he is kind of a scary thing.
It is. I mean, we've seen 16 tackles for loss over the last 2 seasons. He racked up 9 just this past year. So there's something just getting ready to burst. Like this bubble is getting ready to burst. And like you mentioned before, he's really getting ready to kind of break out onto the national scene. And the Broncos haven't exactly been the nation's most popular team over the last couple of years, but we still, even as a rookie, remember, he won Defensive Player of the Week as a rookie.
Yes, he did.
It's kind of crazy what he's been able to do. That's just really flown under the radar. He's not selling a ton of jerseys on the team website. You know, he's not making a ton of the Madden ratings list. I don't see him popping up on a lot of Pro Football Focus tweets, but I think what Draymond Jones has done has been extremely underrated. Shelby Harris gets a ton of credit for the batted passes, and deservedly so. But I think Draymond Jones has been the most consistently productive defensive lineman that the Broncos have had over the last 3 seasons since he came into the league back in 2019. And he just keeps on getting better and better, which to me indicates this is a long-term contract kind of guy. To kind of switch over to that side of things, we've talked about this before as well. I think that Draymond Jones is somebody that you need to lock in at some point to a long-term deal during training camp, if possible, during the preseason, if possible. I think his price is only going to continue to go up and up and up and up. As we've seen his production increase and get better and better, that price is going to only get higher and higher. So George Payton, we know you're listening to this, George. Re-sign Draymond Jones ASAP.
Hey, I don't think Broncos country would be opposed to that. This could be the season we see Draymond break out with double-digit sacks, which I think for a guy who plays defensive end, plays on the defensive interior, if you're able to get around 8 sacks, 10 sacks, that's pretty dang good. That's top tier, unless you're like the guys like Aaron Donald, who sometimes get 19 sacks in the season just because he is the best player in all of professional sports. It's not even close how good he is. So can Draymond Jones emerge in his own right and maybe make a bigger name for himself in 2022? That's something we're going to keep an eye on. But who are some other names that Broncos country needs to keep their eye on at training camp as it pertains to defensive end, defensive tackle, and maybe some interchangeable positions? We get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about our good friends over there, betonline.net. And betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. You can find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games with betonline.net. You can find reviews and news of every single league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered all in one place. So head to betonline.net today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. The Broncos approach training camp here in just a few days at the UCL Training Center, and there are some names that Broncos country needs to keep their eye on when they're sitting on the berm in Dove Valley or they're waiting for recaps of practice here, courtesy of the Locked On Broncos podcast. Thank you once again for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much, Broncos country, for taking time out of your day to listen to all things Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. Sayre, I mean, we focused on DJ Jones, Mike Purcell, Draymond Jones, and some other guys here, but I really think for this defense, if in fact Mike Purcell and DJ Jones don't both start at the same exact time and aren't on the field at the same exact time in the Broncos starting defense, I don't think that you're going to have one of those guys play defensive end and the other guy play D tackle. So for me, I'm looking at it right now. Okay, you have Draymond Jones, who is a solidified defensive end. He's going to be the starter there. Right now, it's really a coin flip. Do we know who's going to start between DJ Jones and Mike Purcell? That's another huge question, because you have Purcell, who's on the back end of his extension. You have DJ Jones, who you just signed to a 3-year deal. Could somebody else emerge at defensive end? I wanted to start off with a wild card. I like to throw a wrench in things sometimes. And I think a player that's not talked about enough, especially with the edge rushers, Jonathon Cooper could slide a little bit to the defensive end position and play. And I tell you what, this is probably going to be in a NASCAR package, which usually is your best overall pass rushers on the team. So you could put him at defensive end. You can have your other guys there at the outside backer position. You could have a Draymond, or you can move a Bradley Chubb or Randy Gregory to defensive end, bring in a Baron Browning or a Nick Benito or a Malik Reed, whoever you may have. They could get very creative, but I would not be surprised if we see a little bit of Jonathon Cooper step in at the defensive end position. And then give us your thoughts on the Broncos rookie addition, Eyioma Uwazurike, as well, out of Iowa State.
Well, I'd love to see Jonathon Cooper playing a little defensive end. We know he's strong enough to do it. I mean, the dude posted like 21 or 23. I can't remember how many bench press reps. He's kind of a freak of nature out there. So it's hard to believe he made it to the 7th round, by the way. It's crazy to think about when you look back on it. But he'll play a versatile role for the Broncos. Eyioma Uwazurike, I think, will as well. We saw at Iowa State, I remember watching one of these games that he played this past year against my own Iowa Hawkeyes, Cody, and it was just the first bit of the game where he was lined up all over the formation. He was everywhere. He played off the edge. He played on the nose tackle right over the center, Tyler Linderbaum. He was all over the defensive line and doing different things for the Cyclones defense. I think we're going to see that as well for the Denver Broncos. There was a number of people when he was drafted, right when he got picked, a number of people were like, that's the Broncos replacement for Shelby Harris, the starter at the defensive end spot. And I think there's some teeth to that. There might be something to that, just because the Broncos didn't have a first round pick. So they obviously felt like Uwazurike was somebody that they prioritize. They get into that fourth round with the trade. By the way, he's also part of that Russell Wilson trade. So as history continues to unfold, he was the pick the Broncos got back from Seattle in that trade. So I think for sure he has a chance to be one of those starters at the defensive end position if it's open-ended, right? I mean, if it's not just Draymond Jones, DJ Jones, and Mike Purcell coming out there, if that's how the Broncos do it, however they would, align those guys, I think Uwazurike has as good a chance as anybody.
And there's another name, too, that a lot of people are bringing up, Matt Henningsen, who is also a draft selection for them. Very strong anchor point. But in my opinion, Sayre, based on his positioning, I think that the Broncos room right now is so loaded with just very good depth. I mean, depth that if they can stay healthy, we believe they could be a top 5 run defense this upcoming season. I feel like this year will be more of a kind of sit back and learn as you grow a little bit. You're going to get a lot of reps in practice on practice squad. I don't know if he's going to be a practice squad player, but you're going to get more reps in practice than you are going to get during an NFL game this season. You're going to get some in the preseason, but the regular season, I don't think the expectation is that Henningsen will play a lot of snaps for the Broncos. It's not a bad thing either if he sits a year and learns behind some of these guys in the defensive line group. You have added depth in some younger guys just in case some of the impending contract situations fall through for the Broncos. So you have to keep your eyes on the future a little bit there. But if he comes in and just absolutely dominates, he could unseat somebody. And then one of those names could be McTelvin Agim, who you and I have been talking about here on the show. We felt like got thrusted a little bit. I think he got shafted out of an opportunity to really contribute last season for the Broncos, despite a very strong preseason, despite a strong training camp. And the games he did get in the regular season, he did look impressive. So this is kind of a big year for a guy like McTelvin Agim. And if Matt Henningsen can come in and impress right away and play better than a guy like Agim, I think that's where you maybe see, Henningsen elevate a little bit in his roster status and the expectation coming into the season. But there's also a few other names. There's 3 names on this Broncos defensive line list. There's even a Jonathon Cooper. We won't spend too much time talking about because we think he's more so a practice squad player at this point. But you have some guys. You have one guy on this list that actually started some games for the Broncos last year, and that is Deshaun Williams. And who are the 2 other guys that Broncos country needs to keep their eye on at this position?
Well, I know Jonathan Harris made some noise there at the end of OTAs. He started to get some people in the media talking about him a little bit. So he's been around for a few years as well. The Broncos plucked him away from the Bears at one point. And even though he wasn't a Fangio guy or anything, I think the scouting department really liked him. As a matter of fact, Cody, I know personally his former coach in college, Coach Jed Stugart, used to be the coach at University of Sioux Falls, where I attended college, had many good conversations with him. And he actually vouches incredibly for Jonathan Harris. He talks very, very highly of Jonathan Harris. So hopefully we'll see. I mean, he's been developing for a couple years for the Broncos. He might actually get a shot this year as we see that defensive end spot is vacated, and he was called up for a couple of games last year as well. I know that Kansas City game, he actually got to play quite a bit. So we might see him. We also might see, could it be Marquise Spencer season, right? I mean, the Broncos took a shot on him in the 7th round of last year's draft. And he's one of the only rookies that we really haven't seen anything hardly from. I mean, other than last year's preseason, we haven't seen much from him at all. But we know another relative athletic score king out there. He's got a high RAS score, and he's certainly intriguing from an athletic perspective. And he showed spurts at Mississippi State as well of being able to be a productive pass rusher there on the defensive line. So I think you got plenty of options here. The question is, do you have enough actual experience to go into camp with these guys and not add anybody else? I think it'll be fascinating to see, but the talent level and the potential is certainly there for new defensive line coach Marcus Dixon, who's going to be getting tips from former defensive line coach Bill Kolar. And then obviously you've got all the other defensive coaches coming together. But man, Marcus Dixon, I think the pressure's on him. You've got a lot of young players to mold. What can you do with these guys and the talent that you've been given?
And even a name I think to keep an eye on would be Deshaun Williams. I mean, he could be one of these other candidates to start a defensive end as well, because even when Shelby dealt with, I think Shelby missed a game or so last season, if I'm not mistaken. And times where Shelby has been unable to go, Deshaun Williams has always been the guy that stepped up and even took over a little bit of that contagious role of deflecting passes at the line of scrimmage. So right now, I'd say it's a good problem to have. I think you make some great points about Marcus Dixon, first-year defensive line coach. This is where I think his feet are going to be held to the fire a little bit, like trial by fire as a young coach. It's not like this is his first time ever doing anything or being in a coaching position. But now when you're the primary responsibility for the defensive line, the personnel right there, it's definitely a lot of pressure. And hey, when you're kind of work with a guy like Bill Kollar, who's as intense as is and is ready to fight the grizzly bear at any moment, you have to bring that heat to practice. You have to have that same mentality, because a lot of these guys on the Broncos defensive line group, for the most part, have played under Bill Kollar. So now it's like, hey, can Marcus Dixon find a way to light that fire in them the way that Coach Kollar did, is a huge question that we're going to look forward to seeing having answered throughout training camp as the Broncos report next week at the UC Health Training Center. But Broncos Country, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode, Locked On Broncos. That'll wrap things up here today. That'll wrap things up for the week. We'll be back on Monday for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, in audio format. The video always drops. If you always want to tune in to the next day's episode of Locked On Broncos early, we drop the video a day early on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. We appreciate you so much. Drop your comments down below in the YouTube comment section. We look forward to interacting with everybody in Broncos Country.